The fog sat low that morning, a gray sheet pulled tight across the lake, muffling the usual slap of water against the shore. I could see the mouth of the cove, but not the far bank. Everything that wasn't metal or color seemed to disappear into a soft, wet silence. My kayak lay where I always left it, nose tucked under a leaning oak, paddle tied to the grommet with paracord frayed at the knot. I inhaled and tasted the lake. Cold, metallic, the faint rot of shoreline weeds. That smell had always felt like safety to me, like a clock I could set my life by. If you like true crime fishing stories and want to hear how this one unfolds, stay with me until the end. Hit subscribe and like if you do. There's more than tension here. There are practical takeaways I wish I'd known sooner. I pushed off at first light. The water was glass. My oar barely left a ripple. I fish because it quiets my head. My father taught me. Dawn, bait, patience. He taught me to watch the water the way other men watch a dashboard. He taught me to listen to the small things. That morning, the small things were wrong. There was a scrape on the gravel where my truck parked, shoe prints that stopped at the reeds, and a wrench half buried in the loam like someone had been working fast and left a tool behind on purpose. I followed the prints along the shoreline because curiosity is a kind of sickness you inherit from fishermen. You look to see if the bite is in the same place. The prints led to a patch of cattails and then to the shallow inlet where the water darkened and the scent changed. There was a heap of trash and branches piled in a way that suggested recent disturbance. Plastic sheeting, a cooler with no lid, a length of rope. And tangled in the ropes, at the edge where the water licked the reeds, was something pale and wrong. I turned my head away for a second. I'm not a soft man, but there are things you can tell yourself you are not ready for. I pulled my phone and took a photo from the path, because that's what you do now, and the camera makes the world into evidence. I dialed 911 and tried to keep my voice calm. "There's a pile by the inlet," I told the dispatcher. "I don't want to touch anything. Please send someone." "Are you in danger right now?" she asked. "No," I said. "Not yet." The county cop who showed up was a young guy with a loose cap and tired eyes. He moved like someone who'd seen the lake in all seasons and knew better than to let the water speak for itself. He and his partner roped off the inlet, took pictures, hauled the cooler out with gloved hands. They called environmental enforcement. They called the county. "It could be anything," the older officer told me, but his jaw was tight. "We have to treat it like the worst till we know otherwise." We all know the script. You mark the perimeter, you wait for the lab, you hear the words, "We can't confirm at this time." The officers were professional, courteous. They thanked me for calling. The younger one handed me a card and told me to call if I saw anyone else. The patrol car drove off, tires hissing on wet gravel, blue lights blinking faint through the fog. I paddled anyway, because the lake is where my mind organizes itself, and because I wanted to see the place with my own eyes after the men with gloves had left. On the water, the day opened into something else. The heap had been moved. The cooler was webbed with police tape that lashed in the wind like a cautionary flag. A piece of chain lay exposed on the bank. There was a glint half buried in the mud near the roots of the oak. Metal, dark, like an old key. I reached it with my paddle and pried it free. It was a small pistol magazine. It had water in it and sand, rust beginning at the seams. I didn't touch it with my bare hands. You don't always get closure. Sometimes you get objects. A magazine, a locket, a flare gun with its safety off. Those things will haunt you because they were once part of someone's plan. I carried the magazine to the officer and watched him close his eyes for the fraction of a second people do before they call it in. My father used to have a story he told when the weather turned cold. He was an old salt of a man before he grew stiffer at the knees, more river than ocean, but he liked to make it sound like sea tales. "Fog takes your eyes," he would say. "Fog keeps your hands busy and your heart quiet, and it lets others walk where you thought only you could go." He'd tell of a night 50 years ago when he and a crew found a small boat cut loose near the shallows, and of men with smoking pipes who acted like children playing at heavy things. He always ended the story with the same lesson. You watch the water, but you watch the edges harder. His story was supposed to be a parable. It turned out to be useful knowledge. When the lab called me 2 days later, they said they couldn't definitively identify the pale material in the pile and that they'd need a second sample. That never sounds like good news. Could be animal, the tech said. We need time. The officers were polite on the phone, but distant. There was always something more pressing in the county. Accidents, domestic calls, thefts. The feed of events pushed softer things down. They logged my statement and told me what number to call if I found anything else. I did find something else. 2 nights after the initial call, I woke to the sound of something dragging across the gravel. I live alone, though my brother's house is a mile down the road and my neighbor checks by sometimes. I grabbed the old Pelican flashlight from the nightstand and went to the window. There was a silhouette at my truck, stooped, working on the back tire. His face was in shadow under a hood. He moved careful and fast, like a man who'd practiced doing wrong by night. I did not go outside. I grabbed the phone, texted my brother with 1 sentence. Someone's at my truck. He called within 3 rings. I put the phone on speaker. Get in the truck, call the cops, he said, without breathing, the way men do when they try to turn fear into a plan. I dialed 911 and whispered into the receiver. There's someone here, at my truck. The operator stayed with me, voice low, asking for location, for description. The man finished and moved away. He walked the length of the porch, and then toward the back of the house. I could hear the scrape of a tool. The porch light catches his outline just long enough for my mind to load him. Broad shoulders, hands that kept still, a click of metal. He didn't knock. He didn't make a move to open a door. He left like a shadow being pulled from the scene. I watched from the curtains until the police cruiser finally slid up the drive, lights reflected as a soft red on the water of the lake. The officers moved slowly, checked the truck, found a small flat and a punctured sidewall, the knife marks clean and professional. We won't tow this tonight, one of them told me. We'll take the report and leave you some advice on staying safe. That was the pattern. Report, record, hatch, lock. The police did what they could, but there was no arrest and there was no follow-up note on my kitchen table saying the case had been solved. It was one of those things you think will be simple, someone in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then you discover how many shades of wrong there are. My brother came over and we sat up all night with the lights on, the old hunting lamps throwing cones across the living room. We boarded up the shed windows in the morning. We bought motion sensors and installed them under the eaves. I changed the way I moved. Rucksack in the butt of the truck now, keys placed where my hand hit them first. I learned to sleep with the phone within reach. The small routines that previously felt like ritual became armor. Weeks later, when I returned to the inlet with a friend who used to run boats out of the marina, we found the tape cut and the cooler gone. The grass was trampled closer to the water. It felt personal, like someone had been removing things they didn't want others to see. My friend put a hand on my shoulder. You stick with your gut, he said. You called it right the first time. He didn't say what I was afraid to say, that I'd been lucky. There was another discovery 3 months after that, the kind that sits in your head like a splinter. I was fishing at dusk, the light thinning, and a flare of red caught my eye on the far bank. At first I thought a truck's taillight. Then I saw it. A small chain, like the ones used to anchor small rowboats, looped and fastened around a locket on a length of chain. The locket was tarnished and dented. I had no right to take it, but the impulse to make things whole is stronger in certain men. Inside was a picture of a woman I didn't know. The edges had been water-stained. It was the kind of thing you tuck in your wallet and never show. It felt like a message left for no one, and everyone. I called the sheriff's office and logged it. The detective who finally spoke to me cut through the pleasantries with a directness I appreciate in this business. We get a lot of noise around that inlet, he said. We run through our list, we check with missing persons, we run DNA if need be. But that takes time. Hold on to whatever you find. Don't touch anything you can't account for. That wasn't comforting. Time doesn't always feel like an ally when the unknown sits in the corners of your life. Time lets doubt grow. The embedded echo of my father's story came back to me then. He had once followed a scent into a shed at the edge of a marsh and come back with a story of men who burned things at night and talked in low voices. He never got anyone to listen the first time. He told his version of events to a neighbor who laughed and said my father had been out too long. Later, the neighbor's son was arrested for a different offense. The lesson didn't change. Watch the edges. After the locket, the nights got worse. Someone moved the gate at the back of my property so that it no longer latched. I found deeper scratches in the paint of my shed door, closer to where the deadbolt sits. Twice, I caught a scent at my kitchen window, like someone had burned something in the yard, a sweet, chemical tang that lodged in the back of my throat. My brother stayed over one night and left before dawn, coffee forgotten, his jaw set. "You could sell the place," he said at one point. I thought about selling everything. I thought about the long mornings in the boat, the small town of men like me who kept paddles oiled and bait coolers stacked. I thought about the way fear steals things slowly, the ability to forget, the small joys that become risk factors. The escalation I feared finally arrived in a way that felt inevitable and cowardly. I was in bed when I heard glass on the gravel, a deliberate sound like a man testing whether something would break. I grabbed the 9mm I owned for protection, a small, compact thing I had purchased years ago and never wanted to use. I don't like guns. I respect them the way you respect a thunderstorm. I told myself over and over to call the police and stay put, but someone was at my back door, the silhouette pressed by the porch light, and then there was a sound like a drop hammer, and the lock gave. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. My hands shook. I told myself I would not let that be the thing that draws a life from me. I could hear footsteps inside the house, soft, like someone walking on the carpet in socks. A whisper sounded. I spun the living room light on and the intruder froze, just inside the broken screen door. For a second, his face was lit, features half hidden under a baseball cap. He raised a hand like a man with a favor, like a man testing how the world would respond to him. "Who is it?" I said. My voice was small and sharp. He didn't answer. He stepped backward toward the screen and then slipped into the night, a shape swallowed by the lake's fog again. I grabbed the phone and dialed my brother. "Get down here," I said. "Now." He arrived in 15 minutes flat, breathless, with a duffel he'd thrown together. We called the police. They took more statements, dusted the porch, and took the screen as evidence. "You did right," one of them said. "Do not engage. We need to locate him." That night, when we finally unclenched, I sat by the window and watched the black water. I felt foolish, and I felt fortunate. The officers left with a promise of increased patrols, and an APB was put out on suspicious persons. There was a sense of motion, of things being done. But motion doesn't always equal resolution. There is a rhythm that fear imposes: waiting, watching, repairing. I replaced the screen. I installed locks that clicked with a satisfyingly final sound. I changed the way I stored my gear. Nothing left outside overnight. My brother gave me a cheap satellite tracker for my kayak. I slept with the bedroom light on for a week. You trust your gut because it is born of experience. It is a distillation of all the times you ignored the small voice and later regretted it. The phrase is trite until it isn't. That voice had kept me alive. Still, the unease settled like silt. I kept seeing comparisons: my father's fog story, the unknown men, the discarded cooler, the locket, the tire slashed. Each item was a grain of a larger pattern I could not name. Then, one evening, someone knocked on my door. It was a slow, deliberate knock. 3 beats, a pause, 1 long. Like a rhythm someone learned as a signal. I stood in the living room with my brother behind me, both of us frozen. The hallway light cast a line down the porch boards. The knob didn't turn. We listened. Nothing else. The knock came again, the same cadence. Another voice trying to weave me into a story I didn't want to join. I pressed my back against the door and breathed out a rhythm that wasn't fear. "Who is it?" I asked. A muffled reply came, low and cracked. A voice that could have been many ages. "Neighbor," it said. "Do you—" "Name," my brother demanded, stepping forward. Silence. Then the slow retreat of footsteps. We called the police. They said they would be there. They took the report and the note of the cadence: 3, pause, 1. as if it could be data. We sat on the couch and counted time the way sailors do in bad weather. An hour per cup of coffee, 3 cups, and the sky would lighten. When they came, the officers weren't as comforting as the uniforms usually were. They were efficient, clinical. They walked the yard with flashlights and asked me questions that made me feel like a witness in someone else's film. Any known enemies? Any surveillance? Anyone who might hold a grudge? There was an answer for each question, and each answer felt insufficient. People hold grudges. People slip by and do things to fit their bliss. People leave the world a little worse for the time they spent in it. The detective who took my report looked at me over his notebook and said, "These are the kinds of things that escalate." He wasn't trying to alarm me. He was trying to be honest. Most of the time, there's a rational explanation, but sometimes there's not. You lock up, you document, you call us, you do not confront. Trust your gut, lock the door, call the police, keep evidence. My father's voice was still in my head, an old radio in the corner, reminding me to watch the edges. I thought that might be the end of it. I thought boarding windows and change of habits would be enough. I thought wrong. A week later, as I returned from a late run to town, headlights in the rear view came close, and then stayed back by a few car lengths, too close to be coincidence. The taillights flicked once in the rain, like a Morse code signal. When I pulled into my drive, the other car lingered and then turned away without passing. My stomach dropped into that particular hollow that tells you when things are not right. I stood on the porch and stared into the wet night until the car's red glow disappeared down the lane. I started carrying a GoPro in my pocket when I walked the property. Not because I wanted footage for anything other than insurance and proof, but because photographs lie less than memory does. The camera gave a shape to the things that had been formless, and yet cameras do not give closure. They give records, and sometimes a piece of proof that the world did not fold in on you alone. It was only later, when I watched a clip back on my phone, that I noticed the shadow at the tree line. Someone standing, very still, hands in pockets, like they'd become a part of the night. The frame was grainy, the figure indistinct, but the way he turned his head to look at the camera felt like a deliberate act of recognition. I reported that to the sheriff. They logged it. They said they'd circulate the image. The image went into a file. Files are hollow things unless someone opens them. The lake had stolen my sense of casual mornings. The boat felt smaller in my hands. The ritual that had bound me to my father, baiting hooks, waiting, listening, had become edged with fear. I still went out sometimes. I am stubborn that way. I would sit and watch the water and tell myself that light finds everything eventually. But light doesn't show who left behind what they didn't want to be found. It only shows you the outlines. The worst feeling was the way the house stopped being a place and became a suggestion of safety. You start noticing the weak places. You fix them. You change your life to respond. You become someone who sleeps with one eye open. And yet, when the first warm morning after the big storm came, I found myself walking the path to the inlet, because old habits are like currents, hard to stand against. The rope along the bank had been mended. The area that had been cleared was tidy, as if someone had finished something and then decided to leave it polished. A new knot had been tied in the same place where the cooler had sat months before. No sign of bodies, no sign of locket or chain, just the smell of fresh-cut weeds and the quiet that follows a storm. I stood a long time, letting the air dry my eyes. I was tired of being afraid. I was tired of the interruptions. But there was a comfort in the ritual of knowing how to move, in the muscle memory of detaching the kayak and pushing off. I had not given up the lake entirely. I had not surrendered the parts of myself that loved the silence. The detective called once more with an update he didn't have. "We're still checking prints," he said. "Still hoping for a lead. We appreciate you keeping your eyes open." "I will," I told him. But the truth was complicated. Keep your eyes open. Keep your locks strong. Keep your phone within reach. Trust your gut. Don't engage. Still, the knock at the door had a resonance that didn't leave. You can fix a screen, you can fix a lock. You cannot fix the knowledge that someone tested your threshold and found it wanting. I think about the men I never saw, their choices, their routines. I think about how many times they might have watched me from the trees and decided I was not worth the trouble. Luck is a shape that tilts in your favor sometimes, and that night I had it. But I don't call it luck. I call it the thin margin between a life with its ordinary edges and a life that skews into danger. I didn't know then that the margin would keep shifting. I didn't know that there would be more signs, or that the town would whisper, or that the investigator's office would juggle my case with others. I only knew that the lake had stopped being the same, and that what I loved about it had become threaded with something colder. That was the state of things when the knock came again, quieter this time, as if the person had learned how to be polite to fear. I peered through the peephole and saw nothing but the glint of wet pavement. The sound of water had become a companion to me. The world felt both very small and very exposed. I made a decision then, half practical, half desperate. I would not let the place win. I would take every sensible step I could, and then stop pretending that any of this was entirely within my control. I called my brother and my friend from the marina. We walked the property together, flashlights making brief moons of the yards. We took photographs. We left the lights on. We made plans. We added cameras in obvious places and some in less obvious spots. And I started to keep a written log. Dates, times, observations, what I saw, and why it mattered. Writing it down made the fear manageable. It made a list out of the shadows. If this was a nightmare, I was learning the grammar of it. You catalog what matters. You secure the house. You keep your mind trained on the small things that indicate movement. You learn to be the kind of person who notices without probing. You do not go it alone. And that's where this story sits for now. A set of measures taken, a crate of photographs lined up like witnesses, a log bristling with dates. The lake still draws me. The water still holds secrets. The men who moved through the reeds remain unnamed and only sometimes seen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the last knock was not the end. It was a question left at my threshold. I thought I had closed things down. I thought barricades and cameras would teach whoever it was to move on. Then, 3 nights later, at a time when the fog hugged the house like an animal, I heard the sound that makes every cautious person shiver, someone whispering my name through the letter slot. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just stood there and listened to the way the voice folded into the wallpaper. It said my name like it owed me something. It ended with a laugh that wasn't quite a laugh at all. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door and felt the heartbeat of the house. My brother slept in the guest room. The cameras blinked quietly in the corner with red lights like tiny eyes. The police had increased their patrols for a while. The detective called occasionally to say there was no match on prints yet. Life spun on with a new carefulness. But the worst part is how normal it felt to hold the 9mm and not want to use it. The saddest part is how ordinary fear begins to feel like a permanent state. So I do the sensible things. I tell the story because there's safety in speaking the truth, because sometimes broadcasting the pattern gets people to look closer. I tell it because if this can help one other person trust their gut and call the police instead of confronting a silhouette, that's worth the cost of telling it. And I tell it because there is one place on the shore where the water still looks like glass, and I want to go back when whatever this is has passed and sit again with the rod in my hands and not have the world whispering threats into my ear. The knock at the door did not end the story. It changed it. It taught me to measure my nights not by the hours, but by the edges that hold them. It taught me to carry light into the dark and to invite others to stand with me when the night feels too wide. There's more I could tell you about the man in the camera grain, about the locket and what the lab found, about the way the officers eventually traced a lead that seemed promising and then frayed. There are threads that still pull loose if you look too hard. But for now, I want you to take away the obvious. Trust your gut, document everything, and don't confront strangers in the dark. Call the police, secure your belongings, tell someone you trust where you will be. Those are small steps, but in this business, they can mean the difference between a story that fades and a nightmare that doesn't. I sit with that knowledge and a paddle across my knees, watching the fog pull back and show the first pale strip of sky. The lake keeps secrets. People keep worse. You learn to live with both. The next morning, I walked the shoreline again. At the far edge of the inlet, not where the cooler had been, but closer to the reeds, someone had left a single red flare, unlit and tucked into the mud like a— It wasn't mine. It wasn't a warning or a promise I wanted. It was a sign that someone had been there recently and that they wanted me to know it. I picked it up. It was warm from the night. I took a photo. I called the detective. I logged the time. I left the flare on my kitchen table like an accusation. Then I sat down and listened to the house creak. The day felt like a thin skin stretched over something bigger. And then the phone rang, with a number I didn't recognize. The detective had something to tell me, he said, something they thought might connect to the locket. He asked me to come in and look at a few photos. I drove the single-lane road to the station with the radio off and my hands tight on the steering wheel. The lake watched me pass. The trees whispered. I drove toward the place where, maybe, finally, the pattern would break. When I arrived, the detective met me at the door with no expression. He led me to the back where a bulletin board held printouts. He pointed to a photograph and then another. "We got a hit," he said. "It's not a full match, but it's something. We want to follow through. Can you come with us to identify?" I swallowed. My throat went dry. The case that had become a catalog of near misses was moving. That was a relief and a new kind of danger. I looked at the detective, then at the photos. There are moments when your instincts and the language of procedure align, and you know the work is going to be hard. We drove out together to a house across town, a modest place with a porch light and a truck out front. The detective approached the door. He knocked, and a man came to it. The man's hands trembled. I am not going to tell you everything that followed. Some things stay longer in a report than in the living room where they belong. But I will tell you this. The man at the door was not the silhouette from the camera. He was someone else entirely, and he had his own story of debts and small crimes. He denied everything at first. The detective asked questions that narrowed the space between us. At one point, when the man reached for his pocket, a different officer stepped forward with speed that made me grateful. The scene tightened and then unfurled into statements and cuffs. The lab took breath, and time did its thing. The report came back weeks later. The locket's trace DNA suggested a possible match to a missing person report out of state years earlier. The magazine had prints that matched a person with a record, different jurisdiction, different charge. The pieces began to align, slowly, like boats pulled up by a current. But even as they did, I felt the residual ache. Confirmation brings relief, but it also brings a hard new truth. The things someone can leave in a lake are not just objects, they are evidence of lives interrupted. When the detective called with the results, I felt something ease in my chest. There was finally a movement toward closure. He thanked me for my reports and my photos. "You did the right things," he said. "You kept a record. You didn't go out and try to be a hero." Those were kind words. They were also correct. I had not confronted a man in the dark. I had not taken unnecessary risks. I had learned to rely on the tools of modern vigilance: cameras, calls, documentation, community. And I had relied on my brother and my friend and the willingness of strangers to show up when called. Even with that progress, I am not the same. I don't assume the water is only peace. I walk the property differently. I sleep lighter. The lake is still beautiful, but the beauty is threaded with memory now. If there is one honest lesson through all of this, it's the power of small acts. A phone call, a photograph, another person's willingness to come hold the night with you. That is what keeps a house from being a target. That is what keeps a life from tilting entirely toward dread. There are more files in that drawer that I like. There are images I still don't look at. There are nights the knock returns to me in dreams. But there are also mornings when the sun breaks gray into color and the water glints and the world seems almost ordinary again. I won't pretend everything is finished. There are threads that still dangle. There are investigations that take time and people who will never be named in my retelling. But there is progress. And there is the cold comfort of knowing you did what you could. If this story resonates with you, if it makes the hairs rise on your arms, do this: subscribe, like, and share with someone who spends time alone in remote places. And, most importantly, if you see something strange, report it. Don't engage. Lock your doors, tell someone where you will be. Trust your instincts. That night by the lake, the fog lifted when the sun came up. The water caught it and turned it into a thread of silver. I took the kayak out again, not because I was brave, but because certain things are worth a measured risk. I left the flare on the kitchen table for the detective. When I pulled in near dawn, the shore was quiet. The only sound was a bird calling somewhere across the cove. I stared at the tree line, at the place the man had stood, and I let the silence hold me for a while. I don't know whether I'll ever feel completely safe by that inlet again. Maybe I won't. Maybe that's the price of walking the edges. But I'm here, and I'm telling you to watch too. And if you ever hear a knock in the night, count the beats, listen to the pause, and then don't open the door until you know who it is. Call the police, call a friend, leave the light on. We all like to think the shoreline belongs to us, but sometimes it belongs to others for a while. You can only do your part to take it back. There are loose ends we'll revisit: the lab report that added a new name to the list, the man who denied everything until the evidence stacked itself, the way the town narrowed its eyes and then opened them. But those are for another telling, and this telling needs to rest for a beat. I clipped the GoPro footage onto my laptop and watched the grainy figure at the tree line again. He lifted his head as if to look straight at me. I think he saw the camera. I think he knew he was being watched. Then he turned and walked away. The lake reflected the sky. My paddle rested across my knees. I breathed and let the air move through me. There are rules to living with fear. Follow them. Trust your gut. Record the evidence. And don't be alone if you can avoid it. I locked the door behind me and left the radio on for the night. I left the flare on the kitchen table like an offering to the clean, pragmatic gods of evidence. It felt oddly ceremonial, a small, plastic promise that someone else had seen the night in the same way I had. Days settled into a rhythm that was not quite normal, but not quite crisis either. There were errands to run, bills to pay, a garden to tend. The ordinary tasks came back to me like clues that life could be assembled again, piece by deliberate piece. Neighbors began to stop more often, not with pity so much as with the practical concern of people who know what a shoreline can take. Mrs. Hargreaves brought lemon cookies and a thermos of coffee and stayed until my answers shortened and then stopped. Marcus, from 2 doors down, offered to check the windows each night. The local bait shop owner, who had never been a friend before, asked if I wanted him to keep an eye out when he trailered his boat past the inlet. Those small gestures accumulated like stones along a path. The detective came by once more with a slow, steady courtesy that felt less like closure and more like scaffolding laid while the town steadied itself. He asked routine questions: dates, times, who else had been there, whether anything else felt off before the night of the knock. He packed his reports into a thin folder and left me a copy of a paper I couldn't yet bring myself to read. "Take your time," he said. "If anything else comes up, you call me. And if you want me to come by when you go out on the kayak, I'll do it." There were practical things to do. Replace the broken lock by the back door, sharpen the knives I used for the kitchen, put a new battery in the motion light. There was the more stubborn work of sorting through the drawer of images and the notebooks where I had recorded small details. I tried, sometimes, to make a map of the nights that had not been ordinary, an inventory, a ledger against fear, but the catalog did not make the past more tolerable. It only made it more comprehensible. At the market one afternoon, a man I had seen at council meetings crossed the aisle and looked at me for longer than politeness required. "Heard about ya," he said, voice lowered. "You're handling it all right?" I nodded. In his eyes, in the eyes of people who had not known me before the night of the knock, I detected something like a recalibration. A person who had been invisible on the edge of town had been made visible by an event that was not meant to make anyone visible. The lab report that later added a meme to the list arrived not as revelation, but as confirmation. It folded a past absence into a present fact. For the family named there was an arrival of grief that was slow and terrible and finally named. For me, the report offered a new measure of the truth I had suspected in the grainy footage, that the figure at the tree line had been more than a shadow, that the shoreline had been a theater of other people's tragedies as well as my own. The man who had been photographed denying everything for weeks kept to his denials until the evidence became a weight he could not bear alone. He hired an attorney, he smiled in court photographs as if public life could be separated from private acts. He denied and deflected, and then, when beads of proof were placed carefully before him, his words grew sparse. In the end, the legal machinery grinds at a different speed than the rest of life. I watched it in sessions where the air tasted like coffee and old paper, and the same patience required to make a case felt like a slow, antiseptic prayer. There were quieter repercussions. I noticed the way my friend, who came down with me to pull the kayak in, avoided standing near the window at night. I noticed my brother make a joke about not leaving me alone that wasn't quite a joke. I caught myself explaining the rules I'd learned. Count the beats of a knock, listen for the pause, never open without a name. You know this, I wanted to say, because the rules keep you from having to make heroic choices you do not need to make. Sleep came in segments. Dreams came, sometimes with the rhythm of oars, sometimes with an echo of that knock. There were nights when the boat glided across glass, and there were others when it felt like hands were reaching from under the water. On good days, the two realities sat apart like guests who tolerated one another. On bad days, they overlapped until I could not tell which was memory and which was invention. I began, slowly and clumsily, to tell the story to people I trusted. Each retelling rearranged the weight of the event a little. Saying the words aloud made the chronology less like an accusation against the world and more like a sequence of things that had happened to an ordinary woman living her life. It allowed friends to offer practical responses instead of blank sympathy. "We can install cameras. I'll come with you tomorrow. Let me have the spare key." Those offers were not miraculous. They were ordinary help multiplied until the edges of fear were blunted. There are things I still do by habit. I carry an extra flashlight in my bag. I leave the porch light on when I go to bed. I tell Marcus when I'll be out on the water. Sometimes those things feel like chains. Other times they feel like armor. There is a difference between living in constant battle mode and living with practical precautions. I am learning to inhabit the middle ground. I don't want to harden into suspicion. There is tenderness left for the lake, for the way it turns every sunrise into a coin of light, for the neighbor who will hand me coffee without a sermon. The town will carry on. The man will face consequences, or he will not. Those are matters for courts and for longer habit and for the steady work of community memory. My part, as I see it now, is simpler and narrower. To continue doing the small acts that keep me and those around me safer, to document truth when it's offered, and to teach the rules I wish someone had taught me before that knock. On the first morning after the lab report, I took the kayak out again before breakfast. The fog hung low, but it was not thick enough to erase the shore. The water was the same color as it had always been, difficult to name, holding light differently from minute to minute. I drifted near the cove and watched the way the trees stood like patient witnesses. The place where the man had stood was an absence, and absence is a kind of presence that shapes everything around it. When I came in, the radio was still on, a small station playing a familiar old song about home. I got the kitchen ready, put another log in the stove, and sat for a moment with a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm because I had been watching the windows. The ordinary tasks did not make the past disappear, but they kept me tethered to a life that could be resumed in increments. There will be more to tell, arraignments, the slow public accounting that happens when a town learns it has been touched by violence. I do not know all of that future yet. What I do know is this: vigilance can be gentle, and community can be a net. You do not have to become fearless. You only need to become careful and honest about the things that trouble you. Keep a record. Tell a friend. Trust the people who show up. The lake keeps its secrets in the deep, but it cannot keep them all forever. Evidence surfaces in time, and belonging can be regained in small, stubborn acts. I dried my hands, folded the towel, and set the flare back in the drawer, not as a trophy, but as a tool. Then I opened the window and listened for the ordinary sounds of morning: a dog barking, a truck on the distant road, a gull calling, as if nothing of consequence had ever happened. For now, that was enough.